good afternoon. So I'm suffering from a cold, so I apologize for that if I'm sounding a little bit stuffed up. But very happy to be here with you, and I'm going to talk a bit about my work related to college access. So if my slides can go up. Wonderful. So yes, as he just said, I'm an economist. I'm in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And economists, you often think, well, our models always say people are rational, they profit maximize and things like that. But what a number of us have realized, and we acknowledge the fact that oftentimes people don't act fully rationally. And there's this whole burgeoning area of economics called behavioral economics that combine economics with psychology and think of all these different ways in which people don't always act what we would think to be completely rational. And so even the title of my talk, Nudging Students into College, there was a wonderful book called Nudge by Thaler and Susstein that take a number of those ideas and apply them in all sorts of areas of our life. And I'm going to apply it to education to see if really small changes that you think wouldn't be a very big deal would have huge impacts on educational outcomes. So just to start off, let me give you some basic facts. If we think about the educational pipeline and looking at some data in Massachusetts, this is from 2004, and thankfully we're getting lots more data as the years go by to really be able to pin down this issue. But let's say we start with 100 ninth graders. 100 ninth graders in a school in Massachusetts, and if we track them 4 years later, how many of them are graduating from high school on time? So we know right away we're losing 24 students, so only 76 of those students are going to graduate from high school on time, and if we were to look in our urban districts, this is actually going to be lower, closer to 50 students. So we're losing a number of students in high school. Now my work really focuses on that transition after high school, but some of the things I'm going to talk about might actually influence whether or not students bother to stick around and graduate from high school. So how many students go into college from high school? That's 76. About 52 are going to go on to college immediately. It's a little bit higher if we say within 2 years of high school graduation. But are they actually staying there? Of the 52, only 40 are still enrolled by their second year of college. So we're losing a number of students right there, really even just the first semester of college. And then only 29 of them are going to graduate either 3 years later with an associate's degree or 6 years later with a bachelor's degree. And Massachusetts has the highest number of the nation, but certainly I don't think this is something we want to feel proud of. We can certainly do much better in terms of getting students through the educational pipeline. So why is it that we're losing students all along the way? In fact, we could go all the way back of who's school ready and preschool and kindergarten, but why is it that we're losing students all along the way, particularly the high school to college transition? Well, I've studied a number of the issues. Why is there a pipeline problem? There are lots of issues having to do with academic preparation, the courses that students take in school, whether or not the teachers are qualified to teach them, whether or not they're too busy teaching to the test and not actually making sure that students are learning. So there's that whole area. And we know that a great number of students who enter colleges are actually being placed in remedial or developmental education. But that's for another day. Another thing that we know is a problem is affordability. And a lot of my work is also focused on the issue of financial aid. Do different kinds of financial aid policies matter? Should we have grants? Should we give them in certain ways? Should we have loans? Should we have tax credits? Things like that. So affordability is also a major reason why we think we're losing students along the pipeline, particularly low-income students. But with those two things, where people have spent lots of time thinking about them, is there another major issue that we're missing? And I know I'm glossing over things like expectations and aspirations and role models, but another major issue that we're missing has to do with information. Let me give you a few facts that really surprised me even as I started to research this area. In 2000, if you were to look at all the students in college at that time, there was a study that identified about 850,000 of those students who were eligible for financial aid but didn't apply for it, and so were basically leaving money on the table. Now these are students who somehow were paying the full bill, made it to college, were taking classes, and there was a program that was designed to help them with their costs. And they were leaving money on the table because they didn't fill out the financial aid form. Now you can imagine with those 850,000, there must have been many, many more who never even went to college because they didn't have the money. Can you imagine how different things would be if all of a sudden people knew about this financial aid benefit that was out there? And in fact, the Spellings Commission, Margaret Spellings was the Secretary of Education, she put together this commission to evaluate the higher education system, and they walked away saying, you know, we know lots of students don't enter college because of inadequate information, rising costs, combined with the confusing financial aid system. So there's something beyond the fact that college costs a lot, beyond the fact we have academics and other kinds of issues, the fact that we have this process set up that somehow we're losing students along the way. If we look at how students get the financial aid, what they have to do is fill out the FAFSA, or the free application for federal student aid. This is what you fill out after you get your taxes done in January, somewhere into April. You can fill it out all the way into summer. For those of you who have recently done this, or you have students, kids who are thinking about going to college, you may have wrestled with this form a bit. Now I want to take you back a few years. Not what we have today, which is still fairly complicated, but let's go back a few years. If we look at the 2009 FAFSA, this is what the form looks like, taking out 4 additional pages with instructions. You have this first page, second, third, fourth. So what you can basically see here is there's page after page after page after page of information that you have to fill out to see whether or not you're actually eligible for financial aid and what you're going to get. So on top of all the other things that you need to do, you need to know that this form exists, you need to know how to fill it out, and you need to be able to turn it in. And so this is what we're seeing as being a major problem. We've got over $200 billion in financial aid that we're giving out every year, but why is it that students and their families don't know about it? Why isn't that they're not taking the steps to actually fill out this form? Do we have an information problem? Do we have an application problem? What could we do about this? And so there's been significant movement in the last couple of years. This is one of the few issues that's somewhat bipartisan in terms of Congress, that we do need to simplify the form. But lots of questions have existed about, well, is this really going to help improve college access? Is this really going to help more people get into college? And then after they get there, are they actually going to stay? So back in 2006, with some good friends of mine, we decided to try an experiment to tackle this problem. But it wasn't only the problem of the FAFSA, a little musical accompaniment. It wasn't only a problem with the FAFSA, but the whole system has some other issues that simplification is not going to solve. The first is, again, the lack of information. Many low-income, first-generation students don't know that financial aid exists, or they think that college costs 3 or 4 times more than what it actually does. So there's this perception that it's really expensive, and there isn't help out there for me in order to be able to afford it. Of course, lack of awareness about the FAFSA. If you ask parents of students who are juniors in high school or even seniors in high school, have you even ever heard of this form? Many have not. You have the missed deadline problem. So as I said before, you can fill up the FAFSA up until the day that you're going to be walking up on campus into late summer. But it turns out that you want to fill it out sooner rather than later, because the FAFSA not only gives you federal aid, but it also gives you state financial aid, as well as a lot of institutional aid and private aid. And for the states, most states, you have to fill this out by April 1st in order to be eligible for these state grant programs. So the sooner you do it, the better. And then finally, the late information. The fact that we don't tell students until the very last second, months before they're going to graduate from high school, that there's money there to help you go to college is very problematic. So as I said before, we have this problem with students dropping out of high school. We have problems with students also not taking courses that might prepare them for college. Is that because they already have made up in their minds that college is not possible for them? They're not going to be able to pay for it. It's too expensive. And the fact that we don't bother to tell them until the last possible minute that aid is waiting for them. So those are some other problems that we were attacking with this project. So with Eric Bettinger, who's a friend of mine at Stanford University, myself, Phil Oriopoulos, who's at the University of Toronto, and Lisa Sembumatsu, who's at the National Bureau of Economic Research, we put together this experiment. And the goal was just to try to understand, first, how could we simplify this whole process? What would be feasible? Second, what would be the effects if we simplified this process? Would we actually see an increase in people filling out their FAFSAs? And would this affect other things that we care about, ultimately college enrollment, college persistence, and getting a post-secondary credential? So we did something that was a little bit different from most of these past experiments, is we did a partnership with H&R Block. This was coming at a time when H&R Block had a public service arm, and they were accepting proposals for projects that might help low and moderate income families. And so we proposed to them, why don't we work together to try to fill out financial aid forms? Now, why H&R Block? First of all, they specialize in the information we need to fill out the form, i.e. tax information, lots of income information. They serve lots of low and moderate income families. In fact, the majority of their clients are low income families. They're able to process lots of income information and do it very quickly in a very high quality way. We don't want to mess this up somehow and have someone think they applied for financial aid when they didn't. And it's also scalable, that if we could prove that this worked at a certain set of offices, then this is something you could easily see going nationwide, and not just with H&R Block, but with all the tax preparation organizations and the community tax preparer organizations, as well as lots of other avenues for trying to have this in schools, online, and so forth. So scalability was another important part. Okay, so what did we do? So first of all, you have a person come into an H&R Block office just the way they normally would, and they would get their taxes done just the way that they normally would. Okay? And we did this experiment in Ohio and in part of North Carolina. And what we learned in talking with a lot of the tax professionals who work for H&R Block is they oftentimes have relationships with these families. These families come in every year for 20 years, and they sit down with their very personal information to help them figure out their taxes. After the person came in and did their taxes, we had some screening mechanisms where we could see, based on their tax form, was their income less than $45,000? And was there someone in their home, either themselves or a dependent, who was between the ages of 15 and 30? If so, we said, are you interested in learning more about higher education? We're here to give you more information. You're free to walk away if you don't want to, but if you're interested, we have some information that we can give you. Okay. Of those who said that they were interested in learning more, there's a consent process that you have to do in these kinds of experiments to respect human subjects. We then randomly assigned all those who said yes into treatment and control groups. The control group, we gave a nice packet of information all about the fact that financial aid does exist. There's this thing called the FAFSA, and there's these resources that you can go access by yourself. And college is important for a number of reasons. There's a return, just some general information they could take home with them. But for the treatment group, the ones that were put in this FAFSA treatment group, the first thing we did is we had built software that was in the background and took all that tax information they had just submitted to H&R Block and basically pre-populated the FAFSA form instantly. We were able to complete about half to two-thirds of the FAFSA just using tax information. And then we figured out a protocol where we could ask the questions for the rest of the form to get it done just as fast as possible. Now, again, we're going back to, we started in this 2006. The first time we did the full implementation of this was 2008. And it was a time when the financial aid form just still jumped around, asked you questions about one topic, then went to another, then went to another. And we streamlined this completely to get it down to the bare minimum number of questions necessary to fill out the form. After you completed the form, given we already had your income information and we know how financial aid is calculated in the United States, we put together an instant personalized estimate of your aid eligibility. So we could tell you on the spot, you're eligible for this in a Pell Grant, you're eligible for that with a state aid. And then, because we know that people are overestimating the cost of college, we gave them 4 local college options that we knew a lot of people from that area where they attended, to give them a sense of this is actually how much college costs, and after all the financial aid you're eligible to receive, this is what your net price would be. So very personalized information. And then if the person wanted to, we had worked out a deal with the US Department of Education where we could submit their FAFSA with the push of a button. So rather than having to send something in paper or go to a site and enter a PIN or anything like that, we could submit the FAFSA direct to the Department of Education, at which point the Department of Education would process everything and they would be in the system and eligible for aid. Now, at this time, and even now, when you ask the government, how long do you think it's going to take for a family to fill out the FAFSA, the estimates they give you are about 1 hour. In reality, it was about 3 hours from what I've heard talking to families. Our process on average took 8 minutes. And that included asking some general background questions to get some idea of the backgrounds of the people who were participating. It included explaining the whole consent process and having them sign those forms, and then doing all of this. On average, we did it in less than 8 minutes. So already, we're feeling pretty good that that this was a feasible thing we could do, but we wanted to know, well, did it actually impact people's outcomes? So let me tell you a little bit more about the people we were helping during this project. Very low-income families. The average amount that they had in their checking account was about $76. Many of them were on public assistance. Many had at least one child. And rather than having a regular high school diploma, many of them had a GED instead. We also talked to a number of the tax professionals, and as much as we could, the actual participants, to find out whether or not they found this to be valuable. Almost everyone we asked, do you want to learn more about higher education, said yes. And most of them were able to fill out their FAFSAs. We even we had a side project that we continue to work on where we were giving 15, 16, 17-year-olds, basically high school sophomores and juniors, that early information where we gave them that early aid estimate of how much they would be eligible to receive, where we weren't actually filling out their FAFSAs for them. So we were giving those letters to the parents, hoping to impact students' decisions while they were still in high school. And one of my co-authors, Eric Bettinger, at the time was at Case Western, and he was working on some other education projects, happened to be talking to a guidance counselor at one of the Cleveland area high schools. And she said, yeah, I'm really puzzled. I keep getting these students who are bringing in these letters saying, we're eligible for $4,000. How do I get this money? And he said, well, that happens to be our project. We're actually going to see whether or not this actually changes some of their decisions earlier on. So we felt like there was some impact and worth in terms of what we were providing to the participants. But in terms of actual cold, hard numbers, not surprisingly, we found that FAFSA submission rates went up tremendously, about 39% for the families that had a high school senior. We also had older, what we call independent students. So these are students who are not financially dependent on their parents. They might have a child, they're a veteran, they're an orphan. We saw an increase of 186% among that group that had not previously gone to college, and even an increase among that group, 58%, for those who had previously been to college. Again, kind of capture the fact that we have lots of people who are going to college but not filling out their financial aid forms. So even being in college didn't necessarily mean that they knew that there was still this financial aid form they should complete. We also were able to complete these forms faster, on average a month earlier for the high school seniors, 3 months earlier for the independent students. So all of a sudden they were eligible for Ohio state aid. But the real question, could such a small experiment, 8 minutes of a person's life, and by the way, we gave them a $20 gift card for their time, but could 8 minutes actually have such a huge, have an impact on enrollment and the money, financial aid that they were actually receiving? And I'm happy to say the answer is yes. So when we tracked people over time and we looked at that group of high school seniors the following fall, were they showing up in college? We had a 7 percentage point increase. So for our treatment group, it was 34%. For our control group, it's 27%. Again, a very, very low-income population where very few people were going to college, and we were able to increase it 7 percentage points in 8 minutes. Now, to give you some perspective on is that big, is that small, as a person who does a lot of research on these issues, that is tremendous. There have been a number of studies about the impact of financial aid, and one study found a similar effect, but that was a study where you had to give students $3,000 to go to a Georgia college or university. So we got the same effect that they got in Georgia for $3,000 for basically $20. In terms of the older independent students, we also found an effect, although it was smaller, and it was very much concentrated among those that made less than $22,000. And for the independent students who had previously been to college, we didn't see an enrollment effect, but if they did go back to college, we did see the fact that they had more financial aid. And if we think financial aid is important for persistence, then hopefully we're going to see an impact on their outcomes. And in fact, I'm happy to say I can now tell you what happened to them 3 years later, because we continue to track them. So this was done in 2008. We continue to see if they're in college and what kind of courses they're taking. 3 years later, we know that they are more likely to be enrolled and to be persisting. It looks like what's to happen is they've actually gone to college sooner. So rather than delaying a year or two, they're going to college immediately. And among practitioners, the feeling is delaying going to college is a major risk factor. We want to smooth that transition, keep people within educational systems, because then we're more likely to see success with them. Okay, so in other words, it looks like we've been requiring all these skills to fill out a FAFSA, which have nothing to do with whether or not you can actually be successful in college. And in fact, we've built these huge barriers for no reason. They're actually keeping us from lots of private and social goals. So to wrap up, sign-up process matters a great deal. Nudges can matter, and we see this in other things like retirement accounts. When you take white-collar, very educated workers and you change the way they sign up for retirement accounts, you get big differences. So this is not something that just happens with students. So we wanted to try to figure out ways to use information to fill out the financial aid form. That's a direction that the government is going in. We also need to do additional outreach. So this was a situation where people were going about doing the things that they would normally do in their day, and we sprung this opportunity on them, and some of them even admitted, you know, if I hadn't gotten the $20 gift card, I wouldn't have actually sat down to do this, but I'm so glad I did. We need to then, once we capture their attention, ride the wave and make it as easy as possible to complete these forms, because forms do matter and can trip people up. And then do things even like when we know someone is already poor in a public assistance program, why don't we do outreach to them? You've already submitted all the documentation. Why do we need to make you fill out pages and pages and pages on an application? And then finally, continuing work with the Department of Education, working with high schools to let them know what their FAFSA submission rates are, so that they can actually be much more proactive in getting students to fill out this form, which although it seems small, makes a big difference. Thank you.